Putin in some ways trying to test out, just to see, because he knows, for example, that the ultra-nationalists will be very hostile, and he already made it very clear that they'll be very hostile to anything that essentially deprives Russia of the momentum that it's currently got. And likewise, they know that many others really, frankly, the majority of Russians want to see this war over and will be happy with anything that brings it closer to that. So, this is Putin just seeing what the situation, what the political situation looks like.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Galeotti, one of the world's leading experts on Russian crime and security. Mark, who was banned by Moscow in 2022, now heads the consultancy Mayak Intelligence and is an honorary professor at University College London and a senior fellow with the Royal United Services Institute and the Council on Geostrategy. He's also the author of more than 30 books, including his latest, Forged in War, a military history of Russia from its beginnings to today. And we always appreciate his time. Mark, welcome back to Frontline.
Yeah, good to be back.
Now, you wrote in the Sunday Times yesterday that Vladimir Putin's dithering over whether to accept this ceasefire deal or not actually fits in with a broader pattern of behaviour we've seen from the Russian president over many years. Can you expand a bit on that for us?
Yeah, it's an interesting paradox, given that we are still conditioned by the old sort of macho iconography that was always put out about Putin, sort of bare-chested on horseback, diving into the deep waters and everything else. In fact, this is a man who is deeply risk-averse, who is actually exceedingly cautious. He only went into Ukraine in February 2022 because he had convinced himself that it was going to be easy. I think he may well have done otherwise if he had some idea of the cataclysmic war that he was about to unleash. But generally, we find that he doesn't like making tough decisions. He tends not to make them quickly. And when he's in a position where it seems to be that there are no really good, safe options, he's often quite paralyzed by that. And we see him, whether it's actually dropping from view, which we've seen in the past, or at the very least tries to kick the can down the road as far as he possibly can.
And you said in your piece that one of the tactics he uses when he's trying to make his mind up is he uses the Russian media almost to gauge the opinion of both the public but also the elites.
Yeah, we must remember that although this is a brutal and thuggish authoritarianism, the Kremlin is also the single biggest user of polling services inside Russia. They are very interested in trying to get a sense of what people, whether it's the elite or the masses, think. Doesn't necessarily mean they're always going to do what the masses want. Absolutely not. But it certainly is information they want to have. And so what we tend to find, and we saw this definitely last week, the latter half of last week, was a whole variety of different sort of lines being tested out. It's almost like workshopping it with the wider Russian public. So, you had some commentators saying, oh my God, no, a ceasefire would just simply give Ukraine the chance to rearm. This would be a terrible dereliction of duty, a veritable betrayal. Then you had people on the other extreme, particularly in, as you'd imagine, the sort of more business press, actually saying, well, just think, if this leads us to a situation where we normalize relations with the United States, we can expect a certain degree of sanctions being lifted. Think of all the opportunities there. And there were other sort of various almost formulations between these two particular extremes. And it was quite striking because in some ways, at first, the media was reporting this very, very blandly, very vanilla, just simply the facts. Then they moved into this whole flurry of opinion pieces. And then around Saturday, they suddenly stopped again in the main. And what we've got to realize is the Russian press is managed by a system of these sort of little notices that put out called temniki, which are these kind of secret guidance, which comes from the presidential administration to the editors of the major news outlets, that essentially says, this is what we want you to talk about. These are the sorts of things to do, or these are the sort of things we don't want you to talk about. So I have a suspicion, and it's just a suspicion, it can't be anything else, that a temnik was put out saying, try out these lines. And then after a certain point, when they felt they had enough data, shall we say, the temnik was put out saying, okay, now settle down. Because I think that, they want to test these lines, but without creating the kind of momentum, which means that people start to expect that a certain outcome will happen. And then if Putin doesn't go that way, then everyone gets disappointed or befuddled. So yes, this was Putin in some ways trying to test out just to see, because he knows, for example, that the ultra-nationalists will be very hostile, and he already made it very clear that they'll be very hostile to anything that essentially deprives Russia of the momentum that it's currently got. And likewise, they know that many others really, I mean, frankly, the majority of Russians want to see this war over and will be happy with anything that brings it closer to that. So, this is Putin just seeing what the situation, what the political situation looks like.
You mentioned the ultranationalists. I mean, and that's a really interesting point, because if you're Vladimir Putin, presumably you are worried that if you accept the premise of this ceasefire, this 30-day ceasefire, and you go for these talks, that there is a risk that the ultranationalists then accuse you almost of selling out the Russian veterans. And if you're Vladimir Putin, how worried are you about that? Are the ultranationalists fundamentally the people you're most worried about?
I mean, it's very difficult to know quite who he's most worried about, but certainly I think one has to recognise that the ultranationalists, they're relatively few in number. They certainly make up in volume, or rather what they lack in numbers, but they're disproportionately important for two reasons. First of all, because they're particularly heavily represented within the military, the police, and the security apparatus. In other words, to put it very bluntly, the guys with guns and the guys on whom Putin will ultimately depend if there's another serious challenge to his leadership. Secondly, there's not that huge body of veterans currently back home, because on the whole, if you sign up, you signed up for the duration of the war. But projecting to the future, at some point there will be an end to this war, whether it's in a month, that'll be lovely, or a 5 years' time, whatever. And then more and more soldiers will come home. And I think the big concern is, look, a lot of these soldiers are going to come home. They're battle scarred. If we look at previous wars, 30 to 35% of them will probably have post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a catastrophic figure. And it's clear that Russia is not really ready to properly integrate these people. So there's going to be a lot of angry, disheartened, confused veterans. And it may well be the ultranationalists who actually can capture a disproportionate share of them by saying, look, you were heroes, but you were let down, you were stabbed in the back. I think that's what Putin's most worried about. It's not so much today's ultranationalists, it's their political capacity in the future.
So even though, if there is any kind of lasting peace deal, whatever the terms of it will be, it'll be portrayed, presumably by Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, as some kind of great Russian victory. Despite that, you think in the long term there's a risk that this message will get through from the ultranationalists that the veterans have been stabbed in the back because they could have had more.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to remember, Russians have had decades, centuries of being lied to by their state. And they are quite adept at holding two truths in their head at the same time. The truth that you have to say at work, out in the streets, because that's the only safe thing to do, and what you really believe and what you talk about around the kitchen table. And I think it's clear already at the moment that a lot of Russians at home are fairly unhappy with what's going on. We know that more than 70% of them have said that they'd be perfectly happy with any kind of peace deal, as long as it's Putin who signs it. In other words, as long as they have Putin as their alibi. So, I mean, in those circumstances, yes, absolutely, Putin and the propaganda machine will present this as a great triumph, because remember, they present what's going on in Ukraine as not just simply a war with Ukraine, but a war with the whole combined West, with Ukraine as the battlefield and Ukrainians as the sort of proxy fighters. So they will say, look, we came up against everything NATO could throw at us. I mean, it's wrong, but nonetheless, that'll be the line. Everything NATO can throw at us. We still managed to save the eastern Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine. We now no longer face a threat from these terrible Ukrainian Nazis, all the usual nonsense talking points. So in that context, they will sell it. And I imagine that a lot of Russians will go along with it, not because they necessarily are convinced, but because they're happy for the war to end. And therefore, in some ways, they have an incentive to say that the emperor's clothes are absolutely wonderful. But there are going to be some who are also thinking, why did my boy, why did my husband, why did my dad fall? Why has someone come home clearly scarred and so forth? What was that for? And did we really win?
I suppose what Vladimir Putin will be weighing up in his mind is, what is the bigger risk, angering the ultranationalists or angering Donald Trump? Because if you reject the ceasefire, you are presumably going to inflame the president of the United States. How will he see that risk currently?
I mean, look, I think, look, the nationalist issue, it's more of a potential future issue. And secondly, it's one that actually plays to the strengths of this regime. This regime is good at silencing people, locking them up, beating them up until they change their views. That's not something that they can do with Donald Trump. And with Donald Trump, it's not just the fear of making him angry, making him disillusioned, and so forth. It's also the fear of losing all the political opportunities that the Trump presidency seems to be offering Russia. And this, to a degree, I think, has been his strategy, insofar as we can use that word for him, in that he has laid out this prospect of normalizing relations, maybe even bringing Russia back into the G7 to make it the G8 again, sort of the group of industrial nations. Even more importantly, at least a certain level of sanctions relief, which again is something that Putin can take back to the Russian people and say, we faced them down, and now things will get better. And even the prospect of some kind of geopolitical realignment. Trump seems to have this vision that Russia can be an ally against China. I think that's highly unlikely. I don't think Putin could risk going against China. But certainly, a closer alignment, and indeed a closer alignment against Europe. I mean, it does seem to be that the European Union has become something of a bugbear for Trump. And if you look at Russian propaganda these days, they're very much pressing the idea that it's these belligerent, hawkish Eurocrats who are the people really pushing the war forward. So I think, with Trump, it's both the danger that he turns and supports Ukraine all the more forcefully, but even more serious than that, I think, is just the loss of the opportunity that Trump offers.
And presumably also there is a risk for Vladimir Putin that if he dithers for too long, he risks alienating Trump, who, his administration has been moving at breakneck speed on all manner of issues. Donald Trump's attention span is relatively limited. And if he thinks that Vladimir Putin is dragging his heels, there are risks there too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is the point about the Trump time in which we all work. I mean, even from my point of view, I have a weekly podcast, and I feel that almost every week I'm having to say, okay, well, we're going to spend the first half of the podcast just simply talking about what's happened this week, even though that's not really what I want to do. And I think in that context, this is why the phone conversation that's meant to be being had between the two of them tomorrow is going to be so important. After all, so long as it's largely about what you happen to say in public pronouncements, or it's from one intermediary talking to another intermediary, it's a lot easier to slow things down. It's a lot easier to say, as Putin has, there are lots of issues which need to be addressed first and require painstaking scrutiny. I mean, one almost wonders, the way he's talking, one almost wonders, how many months' thought does one need to have before a 1-month ceasefire? However, when you're actually faced with a Trump who is clearly eager to get moving, that's going to be a lot harder. And I think this is for me, my suspicion is this is where the can stops bouncing down the road. That Putin has managed to delay. And in fairness, part of the delay was probably to give his troops time to essentially push the Ukrainians out of this little piece of Kursk region that they've held since August of last year, because he didn't want to run the risk of there being Russian territories behind, as he would see it, on the wrong side of the front line when the ceasefire happens. Well, that's essentially taken place. There may be some small territories that are still under Ukrainian control, but essentially they've been pushed out. But now, well, he really is going to have to put up or shut up. And at the moment, I'll be honest, I have no idea what he's going to decide. But interestingly, looking at the kind of discourse we're getting, not just in the Russian media, but talking even off the record with Russians who are close to the Kremlin and so forth, I don't get the sense that they have any idea either.
So that's really interesting. So it genuinely still could go either way. How would you sum up, Mark? Is it even possible to sum up the current state of the relationship between Putin and Trump? Because you hear different people with very different takes on it. I mean, you rightly pointed out in your piece in the Sunday Times yesterday that actually in his first term, Donald Trump was far more hawkish towards Russia than even President Obama was. And, Russian sources saying Trump is no friend of ours. On the other hand, you have people who say that, Trump has long admired Putin and the way he operates. And of course, he sided with Putin over his own intelligence agencies in 2018. So, what is the truth of their relationship at the moment? Do we even know?
Well, of course, again, like all of these things, the honest answer is, and it's incredibly unsatisfying to give, and no doubt for your listeners to hear, me saying, look, we don't know for sure. However, what I would say is, look, Trump seems to have a fascination with the strongmen, the authoritarian leaders, and he scarcely seems to have met any that he doesn't like. Whether we're talking about Xi in China, whether we're talking about Erdogan in Turkey, or whether we're talking about Putin. And I'm not about to go through the thankless task of trying to psychoanalyze Donald Trump, but nonetheless, there does seem to be this desire to be sort of in the strongman club. And also, look, they look at the world the way he does. He has this essentially quite almost 19th century vision of the world, that there's a handful of countries that really matter. And everyone else, the only question is who gets to tell them what to do. And I think that's part of the reason for his very brutal treatment of Ukraine. From his point of view, Ukraine needs to know that it's bought and paid for by Washington, and he will hammer them until they come to heel. So there are kind of reasons why he feels, shall I say, some kind of affinity with Putin. But ultimately, he stands for Donald Trump. I mean, he sided with Putin over his own intelligence services, but that's because it was to his convenience, because he was siding with Putin on the question of whether or not his first election had in any way been helped by Russian intelligence activity. So when it comes down to it, I think the Russians know that they have to be careful. And I think that what we've seen is that Putin is, and it has to be said, I mean, Putin is in so many ways a very mediocre figure. But if he has a skill, it is precisely, and he himself has called it this, his capacity to basically operate with, and more to the point, on other people. He is quite a good manipulator. And there were people within his own administration who were actually concerned the first time he had this phone conversation with Trump that sort of started this whole process of normalization, that he might push too far, that he might mishandle Trump. In fact, it turns out that he seems to have been pitch perfect in his combination of flattery and insinuation and so forth. And we've seen, from the experiences of everyone from Sir Keir Starmer all the way through to Vladimir Zelensky, when you're in the court of King Donald, how you're expected to behave. And Putin manages to hit sort of, on the one hand, at kind of slightly sort of clubby macho-ness that more or less, again, is saying to Trump, yes, you're one of the tough guys club, but also flattering him and fluffing him along. So, he feels happy. The question is, of course, that's all very well, but it can't obscure the fundamental realities of the situation. In the first phone conversation, in some ways, Putin had nothing to lose, because relations between Russia and the West and Russia and the United States were at their lowest ebb since, well, frankly, in many cases, I would say the worst of the Cold War. Now, though, he has something to lose. And he has a very, very specific proposal on the table. And he has an American president who, with one eye on the potential for a Nobel Peace Prize, wants to be moving fast. He's got, from his point of view, I imagine, and this is obviously guesswork, I imagine he feels, look, I've got Ukraine on side now. I've beaten them until they'll go along with what I say. Now it's your turn. And that is going to be the tricky thing for Putin, because you can dance and flatter and weave a certain amount, but when it comes down to it, if you're being asked, so are you going to accept the ceasefire or not? There's only so many caveats with a Trump that you can actually bring into the conversation.
And of course, even were he to accept the ceasefire, that is only the beginning of what will end up being presumably quite a lengthy process, when you then have to have these conversations about what a lasting peace would look like. And how do you currently assess the prospect of any kind of peace agreement being signed? Because publicly, at least, the Kremlin is still making these maximalist territorial claims over Ukraine, even unoccupied parts of Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be cautious in the sense of, again, it's a classic Russian style of negotiation that you always push ridiculously high demands because you're going to be haggled down, and in some ways you hope to average out somewhere high. We can just as easily look, for example, at the Russian rhetoric before, say, Finland joined NATO, that actually Putin was threatening all kinds of things, including actually military action. And then Finland joined NATO nonetheless, and nothing happened. And basically they said, well, that's up to Finland, nothing to do with us. So the Russians have no problem pivoting very, very quickly. They don't get embarrassed by that point. So look, it's very hard to tell. I mean, all I can really say is there are clearly people advising Putin who understand the situation and understand full well that, for example, while I think it's pretty clear that the Russians have no intention of abandoning any of the territory they've conquered, nor can they honestly expect the Ukrainians to withdraw from the regions that Russia is claiming through annexation with absolutely no legal basis, whatever. So look, certainly Putin is being given the advice. Whether he truly listens to the advice is another matter. I think, to be honest, I suspect that the current front line, or basically wherever the troops are, will be the de facto border, even if it's not recognized internationally. The real areas for debate are going to be the shape of Ukraine, the rump Ukraine that is left. Is it barred from joining NATO? Putin would want to say absolutely so. He doesn't seem to have a problem with them joining the European Union, though. Is there going to be some kind of attempt to demand that the Ukrainians limit the size of their armed forces? Again, I think that will be an absolute non-starter for the Ukrainians, but we don't know how far Putin will push on that. So I think this is it. I mean, that's where I think the real area for dispute and debate is. And, of course, reparations. The Ukrainians are going to demand reparations. I cannot see a scenario in which Putin is actually going to provide reparations, but there is mileage with all the money, the Russian state money, that is frozen in the West. We may well see the Russians essentially saying, off the record, but nonetheless saying, okay, you take that and you give it to the Ukrainians, and that can be our reparations. So there is potential mileage, but as you absolutely rightly say, this is just the first stage. If the ceasefire happens, which is still a big if, all we may get then is talks about talks. We're nowhere near the point at which we actually get proper peace negotiations. And still, if I had to come down, I would say still it is at best 50-50 if that's going to happen this year.
And how do you think the Kremlin view what Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, has been promoting in recent weeks, this idea of a coalition of the willing, Downing Street saying potentially more than 30 countries could be part of it, keeping the peace in Ukraine? Is that a non-starter if you're Putin?
I mean, I think it's a non-starter from everyone's point of view, quite frankly. And certainly it's got a lot of derision in the Russian press. Now, again, to a degree, that's their job. But I think what's absolutely clear is that from the Russians' point of view, first of all, these troops will not be called peacekeepers. Peacekeepers is a very sort of technical term. It's about forces which are there under some kind of international mandate, like, say, the United Nations. If there are going to be peacekeepers, the Russians will have the chance to and will say, no, these can't just simply be NATO members. I mean, their view is otherwise at the moment. This looks like a NATO battle force under any other name. Generally speaking, it can only happen. And Emmanuel Macron, I think, is fudging this issue slightly, but that's because he knows his bluff is not going to be called. But Sir Keir Starmer has made it very clear that these would only be in the context of an agreement. They're not going to just sort of roll in there and just simply try and impose a peace. So in other words, the Russians will get to say yes or no. And at the same time, we know that they're at the moment talking about this only in the context of whether or not they have American backing, the so-called American backstop, which could be just simply in terms of American communications and logistics support. But frankly, they're more suggesting that actually it should be America's willingness to come in and basically bail them out if the Russians ignore them and roll in anyway. Now, that is, in effect, asking the United States, are you willing to go to war with Russia in this context? And I see no evidence that Donald Trump is at all interested in that. Quite the opposite, actually. On the whole, the White House is signaling that they really don't see any role for them. They've made it very clear that they think this is Europe's job to deal with. So, in effect, it sounds as if both Moscow and Washington are going to have a veto. So whatever gets brought together in this coalition of the willing, it still feels to me a bit like fantasy football. Coming up with your own imaginary team for a game that's never actually going to happen on a pitch.
Just finally, Mark, if Putin does go for this 30-day ceasefire, do you think there might be a part of him that in the end thinks, yeah, we'll go for it publicly, we'll agree to it in principle, but we can break it. We'll stage a false flag operation accusing the Ukrainians of undermining the terms of the ceasefire, or we'll find some other justification, or we'll let it lapse and then we'll resume our offensive operations. That he might go for it because he knows that it won't lead to a lasting peace.
Yeah, absolutely. It is just a 30-day ceasefire. That's all. And although there's the opportunity for then it to be extended, it doesn't need to be. I mean, I think this is one of the things we've got to appreciate. Look, of course, Putin is not, what sort of, as the term goes, a good faith actor. Of course not. That's why there needs to be some kind of, proper mechanisms, especially when it comes to any kind of real peace. But in the context of a 30-day ceasefire, he doesn't need to come up with some false flag thing. He can just let it run its course, refuse to extend it anymore, and then restart it. However, I think from the point of view of the ultra hawks in Russia, what they're also counting on is that may be what Putin plans. But remember, Putin changes his mind a lot. He's not someone who has a very fixed, rigid strategy. He's an opportunist. He sees what today will bring and tomorrow might be different. So I think they're worried that Putin may well go into a ceasefire or even longer agreements, precisely planning to restart the war as soon as he's ready, but that he may just get used to the peace. He may actually rather like the fact that, American airports are now once again open to Russian flights and that certain forms of economic constraints are being relaxed, and think, oh, actually, this works quite well for us, especially because there'll be a lot of people around him who will be trying to encourage him to precisely maintain that. So, just as we can't assume that if Putin talks peace, he's still going to be thinking peace in a month or 2 months or 3 months' time. But so too, he may plan to restart the war, but might not do it. This is our great analytic dilemma. We are dealing with Trump and Putin, with two figures who absolutely have relatively few constraints on what they do, can and do change their minds, and don't necessarily tell us precisely what they're planning.
Mark, as ever, great to get your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, James Hansen. For more on the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts, you can subscribe or sign up for a membership for exclusive videos. And you can also get the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or from thetimes.com.